Since their inception, first-person shooter games have undergone quite a bit of change. It's a bit old hat at this point, but for the sake of anyone who's a little bit unfamiliar, I'm going to do a quick rundown of the history of the genre. The whole FPS genre does have its roots in things that are like those old 3D maze games, and eventually came into its own with two big origin points, I'd say. Doom and Ultima Underworld. Now, of course, there were true FPSs before this, Wolfenstein being the obvious example, and other ones. However, I'd say that these two form the kind of two core pillars that we'll be looking at. While obviously there has been quite a bit of crossbreeding between the two forms of FPS games over the years, each of these games, I'd say, represents one of the two major schools of thought in regards to the genre. Doom, to put it broadly, represents the second-to-second action, while Ultima takes on the mantle of more long-form gameplay loops. Simply, the philosophy behind Doom is responsible for the 30 seconds of fun principle that we see at the center of Halo's appeal, while the RPG-ness in Ultima eventually turned into the 0451 style of game, which has a focus on long-form systemic gameplay loops. This doesn't mean it has to be an immersive sim, it just means that the focus is less on what you're doing in the moment and more what your actions accumulate to across the course of a game. Now, this isn't to say that one particular game only focuses on one of these categories. For instance, Doom itself has more long-form gameplay loops that manifest them in the form of secrets and inventory management, and overall you'd be hard-pressed to find a game that doesn't take from at least a little bit of both of these styles of games. I'd also argue that a third kind of philosophy has grown up alongside the Doom and Ultima philosophies in the years since their inception, having been codified at various times by games such as Half-Life and the original Medal of Honor. The philosophy of these sorts of games relates to storytelling and the general narrative experience. Of course, FPS games had stories and the like before then, but I do believe it took a bit of time before we moved away from John Carmack's famous quote about video game stories, and instead took it as a key facet of game design. Games as diverse as modern military shooters, Metro 2033, and even Portal would primarily follow this style of philosophy. That's not to say, again, the 0451 games did tend to have a big sense of story, but I'd argue that their main core focus was more on the systems rather than the story, even though games like System Shock had reasonably good stories to begin with. Now, following the success of games like Call of Duty, the approach to FPS gameplay and the general trend of things tended to become more focused on this narrative form of game design, or experiential. Call of Duty doesn't necessarily have a strong narrative, but it has a big focus on experience and immersion in general. While some found this trend to be for the worse, generally in regards to the glut of nationalistic modern military shooters that came and rose up around the 360 and PS3 lifespan, I don't believe that there's actually anything inherently wrong with that form of FPS. In fact, games that rely heavily on this pillar are some of the most widely regarded with cult followings, including the aforementioned Portal and Metro games. However, for Twitch shooters in particular, which attempt to balance their use of the philosophies predominantly in the direction of the Doom school of thought, the uptick in the popularity of the modern military shooter craze did see a steep decline in their success, as well as just their general development. After years of FPS games focusing more on the other two key philosophies, there was eventually a sort of backlash against the story/experiential first game design philosophy that was making up the most of the genre. At first this manifested itself in the form of games like Hard Reset, and eventually became more and more mainstream and more just generally successful, eventually with things like Shadow Warrior Remake coming out, and I'd say in the modern sense culminating in Doom 2016, particularly in terms of like big budget releases. The key unifying features of these remakes, however, is their attempt to fuse the original essence of the Doom philosophy with the trends that had developed over the years, be it improved graphics, emphasis on story, or a stronger implementation of elements of the RPG side of the genre. Some of these attempts are amazing games, including Doom 2016, even though I do have some issues with that, which you might have seen my video on. However, there have been minimal attempts that have tried to stay to be a more pure form of the subgenre, and the ones that have tend to have been even less popular. However, and this is the segue into the rest of the video, I'd say that Dusk, which came out in late 2018, actually managed to do this very well. David Szymanski has been developing games for quite a while at this point. This is an interesting bit of crossover in my channel's lore, but I've actually covered a previous piece of his work, which is the first-person art game A Wolf in Autumn. Coming from that game as a basis of what his work was actually like, I was initially quite surprised to find that this visceral Twitch FPS was created by the same person. However, after finishing the game, I did notice a few decent pieces of continuity if you want to go all auteur theory about it. In particular, I got strong vibes of some of the stuff that was reminiscent of first-person puzzling in A Wolf in Autumn during the last level's introduction stage, where you have to go and collect some crystals and put them on a portal. And I also saw some of the horror elements that we saw glimpses of in A Wolf in Autumn becoming fully formed in Dusk. Okay, so let's start talking about this from the most obvious point, the 90s shooter inspiration. Most of the discussion on this game centers around comparing it to Quake, which is most likely due to the admittedly very obvious visual similarities in art direction and general movement. You get things like a very easy to achieve form of bunny hopping, bringing a detailed movement form that was iconic to games like Quake. However, I'd probably argue that the main inspiration here is probably Doom rather than Quake. Specifically Doom 1, with a little bit of things creeping in from Doom 2, but mostly Doom 1. In particular, I think that the general shooting feels a little bit more like Doom's form of shooting, as well as the level-to-level design being a little bit more close to the Romero style present in Doom 1, rather than the more experimental sort of open levels we saw in Doom 2, and also it's also a bit quite different to the feel of things that came out in Quake. I'd say that there's more of an emphasis on creating narratives within the level design than those other games. It might be a bit confusing because Doom 1 is very abstract, but I'm talking about narrative from more of a gameplay perspective rather than a story narrative, if that makes sense. Graphically, it's hard to deny, and I'm not going to try and do that here, that the game does pull quite a bit from Quake. But it also doesn't restrict itself to only doing things that were possible back in the day. You couldn't have this many enemies. You couldn't have moving level geometry like this. Jib particles, you couldn't have this color, you couldn't have this high definition audio, and all that sort of stuff back in the day. Due to this respect, Dusk really follows the Shovel Knight school of creating a retro video game in the current era. Take what was iconic and liked about those games, while also adding on a couple of modern developments to the graphics and gameplay in ways that make sense without deviating too far from that original school of philosophy. Shovel Knight adds a Dark Souls recovery mechanic. Dusk has Super Hot. Other inspirations can be seen in places like Half-Life. In particular, I'd say this marine enemy gives me strong Half-Life vibes, and just the general physics of items in the area. Stalker, which we can see in some art direction in Act 2. Redneck Rampage, which is admittedly something I haven't really experienced very much of, but it is the general feel of the first act of the game to an extent. And even places like our Type 2 games from the Ultima School, specifically the 0451 games and their general acceptance of multiple approaches to objectives. Dusk takes what people remember about the movement of Twitch shooters, particularly the 3D accelerated ones like Quake, and brings it into the modern day without compromising those core values. Dusk Guy sprints at the speed of sound, just like Doom Guy and Quake Guy does, but he also has newer abilities like a dash slide and the ability to do flips, which were impossibilities in those older games but fit seamlessly into the movement sandbox in a way that things like ledge grabbing just kinda really wouldn't. As I mentioned earlier, bunny hopping is here, but it's way easier to achieve than in the other games, making the whole process just feel more streamlined and intuitive. Overall, the general feeling of the game is very fluid and fast, and instantly responsive. It has a level of mid-air responsiveness, and it really manages to feel just kind of fun to control once you get the feel for it. The weapons themselves are all very satisfying to use, from the weakest melee weapons to basic pistols, all the way up to the explosives and precision weapons. This is a very important thing for shooters to get right, and it's done here using all sorts of audio and animation techniques that have been refined over years past. Now, on the subject of weapons, Szymanski has managed to keep all of these useful throughout the game. Each weapon has a useful role even into the later part of the game, with only the sword arguably making the sickles obsolete. There is meaningful choice involved, even in simple things like whether to use the single or dual pistols due to the difference in rate of fire and accuracy between the two. This usefulness is also increased by the fact that the player has a relatively limited amount of ammo for each of the weapons. Unlike, say, Doom, both the original and the new one, I found that Dusk never really had enough ammo lying around to just rely on one weapon the entire game. This means that old faithfuls like shotguns can't carry you through the whole thing, and the player kinda has to experiment with the sandbox to try and get the most out of their arsenal. This can be made even more prominent by selecting the sickles only starting option, which kind of imitates that pistol only start from Doom. Again, this goes to show how much of an issue it was for someone to be able to coast through Doom 2016 with only their favourite weapon is, and how easily it can be made to avoid. This was a key criticism that I brought up in my Doom 2016 video, the idea that you could just kind of play through the game using just the shotgun and the rocket launcher, and weapons like the pistol just kind of fell out of use as the game went on. Alright, well that's enough ragging on Doom 2016. For now. There's also a commitment here to keeping some of the older quirks of game and level design, which I actually think works quite strongly to the game's credit. The game uses monster closets to spawn new enemies, which is an element of 90s shooters that I've always kind of understood was there, particularly because I made some crappy Doom mods back in the day. However, its inclusion here really stood out to me. I think that it really works to the game's credit. It's just a small thing, but it really adds to an idea of authenticity that the game is striving for. It would have been pretty simple to simply make these enemies spawn in these situations, but I think it goes to show that Szymanski put some serious thought into how he wanted to present the game as being emblematic of 90s shooter design. The inclusion of other elements that have been criticized as flaws of the game genre, such as maze-like level design and keycards, have definitely been expected inclusions here. However, the levels have been designed in such a way that they remain satisfyingly complex, while also managing to be intuitively readable and not so complex that the player has to spend more time running in circles trying to find where they have to go, rather than actually playing the game. This was a problem in not so much Doom 2016 due to just how kind of boring and straight those levels were, but more so in the later aspects of Doom 1 and definitely Doom 2, where it could be kind of confusing where the player just needed to go, or they could pick up a new keycard and just kind of spend ages wondering if they had even seen a red door for the red keycard yet. This is mostly done in Dusk by keeping each section to loop back to where the player needs to go next. For example, generally picking up a keycard will either have a path that leads back to where the player needs to use the key, or the keycard itself will just be relatively close to the door. The general design of the game also feels relatively retro, in the fact that it doesn't actually require the high skill ceiling techniques that 90s shooters became famous for in order to be completed. But it does also capitalize on the lessons that people have learned over these years to make many optional opportunities for the player to exploit these if they've got some experience with them. For instance, techniques like rocket jumping and particularly bunny hopping were generally initially found to be a bit of an exploit or just an unintended feature, and therefore the game designers didn't really build levels around them. These high advanced techniques did eventually become and get a life of their own in things like multiplayer and also in later iterations of the genre, but the way that the game has chosen to include them makes it feel authentic to the old style where they weren't known about, but there's still opportunity to use them to your benefit. Rocket jumps, for instance, can save time or open up secrets, and bunny hopping can give you an edge in hectic combat encounters, particularly on higher difficulties. Overall, Dusk manages to really strike a feeling of authenticity in gameplay design without compromising too much on the experience for modern audiences. Now, moving on from strictly gameplay, we're going to look at the horror atmosphere, which is, I think, something that this game does really quite well. Horror itself is something that has been present in first-person genre for almost as long as it's existed as an inherent aspect of the perspective. Obviously being right down in the midst of something, only being able to see what your character could see, is going to tend to be more scary than just having an isometric perspective, for instance. Of course, you wouldn't consider games like Borderlands to be a horror game, but due to the natural aptitude for jump scares that a limited perspective of the first-person genre has, and the unnatural and uncanny look that many early examples of FPS games have, many of the very first games became so influential to the genre, and they ended up having horror elements, whether or not they intended to. In particular, the key touchstones of the genre being Doom and Quake have a very explicit horror theming, even if it doesn't necessarily bring the fear to a modern viewer as it did back in the day. There's no denying that these games were often considered to be very scary back then, and even on occasion can be a little bit tense nowadays. Part of this is actually due to the graphical limitations of the game, as it's much scarier to imagine what a mess of pixels might represent in your mind, as it could be anything, rather than having it rendered in full detail. A nice and clear example of this is the original Silent Hill, which has the weird wibbly-wobbly PS1 polygons combined with thick fog that reduces the render distance but also comes together to create a horror environment that really invokes real scares that are mostly in the mind of the viewer. In Dusk, Szymanski uses his general aptitude for creating a dark horror environment and combines it with the abstract industrial gothic style that is partially a callback to the visual stylings of games like Quake, and creates a game that is one of the truly frightening games that I've actually played in a little while. In particular, I found the second chapter of the game to be one of the most effective at this, as it has the player work their way further and further into the bowels of a terrifying machine that eventually becomes more and more insane the deeper the player gets. This is a particularly good way to create horror in the stalker-inspired factories that comprise the beginning of the act, and the systemic killing and dismemberment that this machine represents ties directly in with ideas that are pretty common behind industrial and grunge-type movements that Dusk draws heavily from, appropriately because they were very strong in the 90s. If you want to get really English teacher about it, you could even say that the machine represents a Marxist message, as it's to do with the exploitation of workers in an industrialized world. Or maybe that's just me. On multiple occasions, the game pulls your torch, translation, flashlight, out from under you as a crutch to increase the tension of the area. While I did find it quite a bit comical the way that this is done repeatedly by just having it break after a long fall. Like, seriously, is Dusk Guy just trying to land on his torch to break his fall? What's going on here? The effect of taking away a source of visibility that the player has gotten reliant on, in combination with forcing the player into some of the most well-crafted horror scenes in the game, means that the player is set up to be in a mindset that is the same as they would have going on into something like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. Despite the player being incredibly empowered and realistically not in any true form of danger, the gameplay and visual language makes the player feel disempowered by simply removing one of their non-combat abilities. This is simple, effective game design that not only manages to create a horror atmosphere, but manages to provide some good pacing in an otherwise rocketing action rollercoaster. These sequences are further enhanced by generally being very short. The player generally gets a new flash torch within only, say, 5 or so minutes, and it means that the player doesn't have to deal with bumbling around in the dark for any longer than what is needed. This approach to pacing can be seen all across the game, to the extent that I believe that the game generally does pacing better than a lot of Dusk's inspirations. While there is a criticism to be made about the amount of weapon variety, it's possible to get every weapon in the game in the first act, the weapon resets do wonders to keep the player always on the lookout for more equipment. One of my key criticisms that I leveled at Doom 2016 was that secret hunting was generally under-encouraged due to the player being able to obtain all weapons in the sandbox fairly early on. Some of my YouTube comments found the weapon reset idea to be absolutely outrageous as a concept, but I believe its presence here and in the original Doom, as well as their absence in Doom 2 and Doom 2016, show that they have a strong place in keeping the gameplay fresh. For instance, the third act of the game introduces weapons such as the sword and crossbow fairly early on, making the player adapt to different strategies than they might otherwise need to, due to the staples such as the shotgun and grenade launcher being delayed until later. E3M1 can even explicitly show how weapon resets can encourage secret hunting by placing a grenade launcher conspicuously just out of reach at the start of an area. Secret hunting is very important in Twitch shooters as it creates natural lulls in the action, which in turn means that the action itself becomes more meaningful due to it being more spaced out. Even better, this form of secret hunting means that, if it's done well, the player can choose how long their lulls can last for, as they can move on whenever they feel like it. Super Bunny Hop's video on the action versus traction of Doom and the importance of quiet time cover these arguments and go into a bit of detail about how secret hunting can both be beneficial and also a negative, and just generally how pacing is important to games, and I recommend you go watch them if you want some more insights on these points. Dusk even manages to keep the environmental design fairly interesting as things goes on. In a similar manner to Doom 1, each episode represents a slow descent into madness. In Doom, we start on the Phobos moonbase, which represents the familiar, and then descend into the corrupted version of the moonbase on Demios, representing a disturbed borderland between worlds. And we finally fall down into the pits of hell themselves, which are an abstract land with no real ties to reality. Dusk similarly starts out in a familiar landscape, being these countryside farms of Pennsylvania, eventually entering into a corrupted factory that contains a machine that acts as a disturbed borderland between worlds, and we finally end in a completely abstract chaos land that's quite thematically similar to the Gothic castles of Quake. This change is both thematically appropriate, but also serves to keep things interesting from a gameplay perspective, as these environmental changes tend to affect how the levels are designed. Unlike the original Doom, this progression is also far more gradual, with the theme evolving within the chapter, not just between. Compare where the second chapter starts, which is somewhat relatively normal looking factories, and see how it ends with this monstrosity of something. While the weapon variety doesn't keep up with the level design's descent into chaos, the game does manage to keep an increased amount of enemy variety, as well as power-ups as the game progresses. There's never really a point where the player can become too comfortable with the enemy roster, as new enemies keep things interesting, and the game also manages to put some of the bad guys temporarily on hold for a little while, and bring them back in later, which effectively makes them feel a little bit fresh again. General encounter design is also quite tight, with a nice combination of unique and interesting encounters that make the player experiment, and then just fun tried and true regular encounters peppered throughout. The game never really suffers from another of Doom 2016's biggest problems, which is that the gameplay just kind of devolved into a slog of samey arenas over and over again. The closest the game gets to arena-based combat is E3M9. This penultimate encounter rests in the mission before the back-to-back boss battles of E3M10, and essentially acts as the climax and final test of the general mob encounters that make up the rest of the game. As Dusk never really did too many of these big respawning arena encounters, the big fight feels really fresh, intense, and a final test of the player's understanding of the core game mechanics, rather than just a bland trudge to the end of the game that the final encounters of Doom 2016 were. Overall, I think that all of these things manage to come together and show that Dusk can reflect the key elements of our Type 1 FPS games in a way that not only makes the game feel like a classic member of the circa 1996 crew, but also manages to take into consideration the lessons learnt, not only from its own type of game, but also from other developments over the decades that followed its inspirations. It really does manage to nail the aesthetic and gameplay style that is clearly evocative of the classic games that it intends to replicate, while also striking a balance between its various influences, and makes it really feel like it stands on its own rather than just being a simple imitation of the source material. Overall, I think that is really Dusk's greatest success. The ability for it to not only replicate the style of games like Quake, but also avoid becoming something like a parody, and instead coming through to the point that it can even rank among those titans.